First of all, let me thank all my colleagues on this platform. It's a great privilege. We have a, a very dear common friend with Megha, who has actually introduced us. Otherwise, I've never had a chance to appear on this platform, Manisha Gupte. So here I am with my very limited knowledge, but whatever I can share with you, it's going to be something which comes from my heart. So I think the subject that you have chosen is really, very daunting subject, because it's a need of the day also. Role of literary translations to build dialogue between South Asians. And what more can we want today than to build a dialogue between South Asians? And unfortunately, that dialogue is always, it always becomes a victim of politics. So when we think of South Asia, we think of a part of our heart and soul, whether it's Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, that's where, it pulsates with us. And we can't overcome that distance. I say that with some amount of personal anguish, because I don't know, you have known me a little bit through maybe the little work that I've done with some government bodies like Planning Commission or Women's Commission. But 90% of my family in 1947 were forced to leave our hometown, which was Panipat, undivided Punjab, forced to leave and bundled into trucks and sent across the border. And now, at this point in my life, when my near and dear ones need the love and support that can come only from people who have known that history, it's not possible. It's no longer possible. So this is the reality. And I say that with knowing that there are understanding faces in front of me who can empathize with me. So role of literary translations to build dialogue between South Asians. I'm also a translator, though not as prolific or as distinguished as what I've heard from my colleague who introduced this session. My translations are always in English language. My Urdu language and English language is on par. So I think I know, and because I know Urdu, I know a little bit Farsi, I know a little bit Arabic because I read the Quran. But I don't translate the other way around. So that's my scope. I just thought I'll share that with you. Translations between languages, they create that understanding which newspapers and articles and all, those are living characters that create that understanding, which translations do. And the most beautiful thing is to translate from Hindi to Urdu or Urdu to Hindi, because it's mostly transliteration and you change the vocabulary a little bit. But that is delightful. But anyway, I don't do it, so I can't claim any expertise in that. I know that we have all grown up reading European literature in translation, mostly in English. What would we have been today without Chekhov, without Tolstoy, without all the great masters of European literature we grew up with only in translation? And here, when I was growing up, uh, actually I was quite small, and I used to have access to my mother's library, where there were Urdu translations of English, French, and Russian, mostly classic novels, and also Urdu translation of Bengali novels. So my whole orientation towards translation started when I was 6 or 7 years old, going quietly and looking through my mother's library. Most of those books we are not really allowed to read them, but for very many reasons, which I'll go into later. But one of the books I remember in translation was, there was a man called Rider Haggard, and he wrote something called She. And that was a great, great classic. He was a British writer and a great classic novel. And that was translated as Azra. And The Return of She was translated as Azra Ki Vapsi. That, and today, when I was putting my thoughts together for this seminar, I went into, those archives, and I looked at them, and I thought, my God, the world opened in front of us because of the fact that these translations existed. So my first foray into translation is my book, which Megha referred to in our conversation. And that book was published some time ago. It's called Parvaz. Parvaz literally means flight. And these are short stories of writers who wrote in Urdu. That was the common factor in these among these writers. And these were, let me just backtrack and say that in 1990, the first woman by the name of Muhammadi Begum took out the first novel, which was called Tehzeeb-e-Niswa. Tehzeeb-e-Niswa means, Tehzeeb means culture, and Niswa means women, women's culture. Now, I'm talking of 1998, Muhammadi Begum. And the same year, another woman called Akbari Begum wrote a novel called Islahun Nisa. Now, please remember, the word Nisa means women. There's a surah in the Quran, which is Surah Al-Nisa, which is the surah all about the rights of women in Islam. And women have a lot of rights in Islam, but that's another story for another time. And that's one of the areas in which I have done a lot of work, women in Islam. So this novel, Islahun Nisa, which Islam means reform among the women. Now, we're talking of that year when this was published, in which the story was of a Nawabzadi. Nawabzadi is a princess. A princess, not a sort of a very high-ranking princess, but a lot of Nawabs all over the place. Nawabzadi of Lucknow, who was learning maths and chemistry at home, 1898. So that's how far this, women's reform, women's education, that's how far it began. Now, Parvaz, this book of mine, Parvaz, which is Urdu short stories by women, we talk of borders and boundaries, right? So let me just tell you that the short stories that I have translated here, are they from India or they are from Pakistan? It's very hard to say, okay? The borders and boundaries become very blurred. The first story is by a woman whose name is Rashid Jahan. And she was from Aligarh, from a very educated family. Her father was responsible for establishing the Women's College of Aligarh. And she created a storm because she edited a collection of short stories which completely, revolutionized women's literature. And this book by Rashid Jahan from Aligarh, I mean, she became, by the way, the novel, the collection of short stories was called Angare. That is, Angare, Angar. It's a Marathi word also. So it had short stories about which, from the progressive writers movement, started with Rashid Jahan. So the first story that we have done is Rashid Jahan. Then the other next story is by a woman called Hijab Imtiaz Ali. Now she was a very modern woman, and she was writing in the early 20th century. She was the first woman pilot, and she lived in Hyderabad, but then she went to Pakistan. So her stories bordered on the fantastic. So I, as a child, by the way, I was extremely fascinated with this fantasy world that she projected. The next is, okay, that's also very interesting. The next story is by a woman called Khurshid Mirza. Now, she is Rashid Jahan's sister. So both of them very progressive, very advanced, very progressive, very educated parents. Her father was Sheikh Abdullah, not to be mistaken by the Lion of Kashmir. It was another Sheikh Abdullah who established the women's college, and his wife her name was Alabi, and she was very instrumental in women's education. And she wrote short stories. We included her because then she went on to join Bombay Films, and her film name was Renuka Devi. And the first film that she made was called Naya Sansar, with Ashok Kumar. And Naya Sansar, the story was by my uncle, another very well-known director and writer and very well-known journalist called Khwaja Ahmad Abbas. So Naya Sansar, with the story by Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, with Khurshid Mirza, who had by now become Renuka Devi. So that's the other story. Then there is the story by Ismat Chugtai. Now, Ismat Chugtai, of course, is a household name, a household word. And although I did translate with a very close relative of mine, who's also a very well-known translator, Tahira Naqvi. She's from originally from Pakistan, now settled in New York. And it was called The Quilt and Other Stories. And everyone reads Quilt, everyone knows Quilt, Razai, the story of Razai. So, I mean, and you know that Ismat Chuktai's whole background, that she lived in Allahabad, she lived in Aligarh, and finally joined, went to Bombay, and with her husband, Shahid Latif, they became directors, producers, and they went into the Bollywood sphere of life. And the story that we chose was for this collection was not the quill, but it was called Genda. And Genda means this gudhal kapul. I'm not gudhal. This I don't know what you call it. It's a flower which you use for puja all the time. That is Genda. And so that was the name of and it's her stories are all repressed sexualities, and that became sort of the first book about same-sex love. Became first story was Lihaf, and then it went on, and this was it. Then there was a reformist woman who wrote about women's reform, and her name was Saleha, and she used to live. I live in Jamia in Delhi, and Jamia, of course, everyone knows after what happened with the CAA and NRC and Shaheen Bagh. So I lived right next door to it, and she lived here, and she believed that stories have to have a reformist angle. And she was, from Panipat. And the next story, and another very interesting person is a woman whose name was Razia Sajjad Zahir. And her husband was I would say, the highest ideologue of the progressive writers movement, Sajjad Zahir, who was known as Banne Bhai. So Banne Bhai and Razia Appa, they were, another generation and all, but that's how we used to call them. She wrote this delightful story called Langdi Mumani. Langri Momani is an aunt who's lame, and she stands up for women's rights. And I'll quickly go through the others, but I don't want to spend spend all the time in describing my parvaz. I don't even think this book is any time available now. But these were writers who were from uh, Lucknow, went to Pakistan. They were from Badaयूं in UP, went to Pakistan. They were from Hyderabad, they went to Pakistan. So, um, this is what literature is. I mean, what can you say? Borders and boundaries become very soft, and or more or less, these are, we have to contend with them. And literature, expands beyond borders and boundaries. But the last person I want to talk about is a woman called Kuratulan Heather. She was Saitya, like she lived in Bombay, she lived in Aligarh, she lived in London, she lived in Delhi, she lived in Karachi. She was everywhere. And winner of Sahitya Academy Award, one of the, I remember her so well, in so much a part of my life, that, and um, she and Ismat Apa were like polarities. Ismat Chuktai, very earthy, and Kuratullah and Heather, very elitist, but with total control of her idiom. And her books have been translated into so many languages. Her books, like about at least a dozen novels, a dozen collection of short stories translated in so many languages. And by the way, before I forget, my colleague told me, as when I was preparing for this, she said, please tell them that your Parvaz was translated into Japanese. Well, I had completely forgotten that, but now when she reminded me that, I thought, yes, that's true. So that is one part of my work in translation. And I think that some of these, and now I'm talking none of these women are, except I think one of them, Jilani Bano, I have included Jilani Bano in this connection, in this collection. And uh, and her story is called Bin Bulai Mehman, which means those guests that you don't call, they just drop in. So she's the only one who's living. All of them have passed away. So, and then there is a whole bunch of new women writers who are now writing. And about a couple of months ago, I was invited to launch 5 books of 4 writers who were like, write for today. They were writing today. And so that also, for another session, another time. But since this is my work, I thought I'll share it with you. And then I want to just share one more work of mine with you, which is, I think, a very important translation, and which needs to be translated in many languages. And this is, I mean, like Megha is an expert in Russian. So here is a book which is written by a man called Altaf Hussain Hali, and he lived in Panipat. And he was the first feminist poet of this entire South Asia. He wrote about women, he wrote about the right, and all in poetry, mind you, the rights of women, the how the deprivation of women, the oppression of women, and he wrote, he was uh, such an ardent supporter of women's rights. And he was also a Maulana. So he was called Maulana Altaf Hussain Hali, and nobody could stand against him, because he was, how could anyone say anything to a Maulana when he was talking about the rights of women? And I'll quote you one little verse from Hali, which will give you the sense. He says, he addresses the women, and look at the irony in his poetry. He says, and I'm going to say it in Urdu and translate it for you, Jab tak raho tum ilmo danish se raho mehroom ya. Meaning, till you are alive, you're not educated. Jab tak raho tum ilmo danish se raho mehroom ya, jaisi thi aayi bekhabar, waise hi jao bekhabar. You came ignorant and you go ignorant from here. जब तक रहो तुम इल्मो दानिश से रहो महरूम या, जैसी थी आई बेखबर वैसी ही जाओ बेखबर, जो इल्म मर्दों के लिए समझा गया आबे हयात. For men, education was considered an elixir of life. जो इल्म मर्दों के लिए समझा गया आबे हयात, ठहरा तुम्हारे हक में वो जहरे हलाहल सर बसर. For you it was considered poison. For men, education was the elixir, and for you it is poison. जो इल्म मर्दों के लिए समझा गया आबे हयात, ठहरा तुम्हारे हक में वो जहरे हलाहल सर बसर. आता है वक्त इंसाफ का. The time has come for justice. आता है वक्त इंसाफ का, नजदीक है यौमुल हिसाब. The day of judgment is coming. The day of judgment is coming, and this is the time of reckoning. आता है वक्त इंसाफ का, नजदीक है यौमुल हिसाब. मर्दों को देना होगा इन हक तलफियों का वहां जवाब. Men have deprived you of right, and they will have to speak and they will have to answer for this deprivation when the day of judgment comes. आता है वक्त इंसाफ का, नजदीक है यौमुल हिसाब. मर्दों को देना होगा इन हक तलफियों का वहां जवाब. Now, why can't these things be translated? I mean, Marathi is the most beautiful language. I know because my uncle was a great, Haji Ahmad Abbas lived, with a completely Marathi ethos. So I know it without actually. So, and the other thing that, three things Hali stood for, and I want to just sum up my remarks by talking about Hali, and in the end I'll quote one little piece of poetry from a friend who's writing now, like he wrote it very recently, and I promised him that this is very relevant, so I'll quote you. Anyway, the second subject that Hali believed in was that this country's future, this country's prosperity, this country's sustenance depends on Hindu-Muslim unity. Hindu-Muslim ittihad, Hindu-Muslim ittihad. और आप लोगों के यहाँ तो हिंदू मुस्लिम इत्तेहाद की बहुत बात होती है, जहाँ से आप, जिस यूनिवर्सिटी से आप इस वक्त जहाँ प्रेजेंट कर रहे हैं. So Hindu Muslim Ittihad, he believed in it, he talked about it, and he said it is the duty, your religious duty, to have Hindu Muslim unity to get, the country has to be rise to freedom. And 1905 he wrote this, and I'll again quote from Hali. तुम अगर चाहते हो, this is very simple, तुम अगर चाहते हो मुल्क की खैर, तुम अगर चाहते हो मुल्क की खैर, न किसी हम वतन को समझो गैर, हो मुसलमान उसमें या हिंदू. तुम अगर चाहते हो मुल्क की खैर, न किसी हम वतन को समझो गैर, हो मुसलमान उसमें या हिंदू, बौद्ध मजहब हो या हो सिख बंधु, सबको मीठी निगाह से देखो, सबको मीठी निगाह से देखो, समझो आंखों की पुतलियां सबको. They are the pupils of your eye. Putli means the pupil. सबको मीठी निगाह से देखो, समझो आंखों की पुतलियां सबको. And then he says, मुल्क है इत्तेफाक से आबाद. The country is prosperous because we have ittifaq. We have a sort of a bhai behan chara. I can't find another word for it. मुल्क है इत्तिफाक से आबाद, कौम है इल्तिफात से आजाद. इल्तिफात means लुत्फ, love. आजाद हैं because हमारे पास प्यार है. कौम है इत्तिफाक से आबाद, मुल्क है इल्तिफात से आजाद. मुल्क में इत्तिफाक होता अगर, मुल्क में इत्तिफाक होता अगर, खाते गैरों की ठोकरें क्यों कर? Question mark. Because we let go of Hindu-Muslim ittihad, इसीलिए हमको गैरों ने ठोकरें लगाई हैं. We have been beaten up by strangers. So this was the other point that is important, why Hali needs to be, I did a verse translation of his most important poem. It's a long poem. It is a poem of, I think, 290 I don't know what you call them, cantos. I mean, 6 lines. And it's called Musaddas-e Hali, Musaddas means simply a 6-line stanza. It's a technical word. Okay, so this is the book that I have done, and it's called Musaddas-e-Hali, and it is a verse translation of his book on reform in Islam. Reform in Islam, the very reform because of which Islam today is the most badname zabana religion in the world. Anti-women, anti-peace, every noble quality, and Islam militates against it. And Hali wrote this 290 Musaddas verses on reform in Islam. And I translated them. And I remember when I was doing this, I was talking to Mr. Khushwant Singh, who was a very good friend of mine and inspired me a lot. And I said to him, I cannot possibly translate it in English verse. I mean, I'm just going mad thinking, how am I going to rhyme the end words? And he said to me one thing, and I want to share it with you, my dear friends. And he said, if I can translate Allama Iqbal's Shikwa Jawab Shikwa. Allama Iqbal wrote a long poem in which it was a complaint to Allah, and Allah answers the complaint of human beings. Shikwa means complaint. And it was called Shikwa, and the answer of Allah was Jawab Shikwa. So he said, if I can translate Iqbal into verse, why can't you translate Hali into verse? So because of his inspiration and not even his prodding me continuously, then I was able to do this Musaddas-e-Hali, and it is called A Story in Verse of Ebb and Tide of Islam. Islam degenerated because of what the Muslims did to Islam. So this is, and again, a Maulana doing this, who could ever say anything? And I'm told, I've read accounts that when there were big mehfils in which Musaddas was recited and sometimes sung, people used to cry and weep because they said, what have we done? What have we done? So these are like gems. They bring our consciousness to the fore. They bring मुल्कों को इकट्ठा लाते हैं, South Asia को इकट्ठा लाते, because our the problems just flow easily एक दूसरे के साथ. The problems are very common. And I have to end now, and I want to end with a friend of mine a young man whose name is Ankush Gupta, and he calls himself Ankush Gupta Siraj. Now, all poets, have a poetic name, and in Urdu we call it takhallus. So I asked him, I said, Ankush, what is your takhallus? He said Siraj. And he went to Pakistan in 2013. And by the way, before I say this, I have to tell you also that last night I got this little video clip, and guess what? Shafqat Amanat Ali singing Vaishnav Jan. Beautiful, beautiful. Shafqat Amanat Ali Khan in Pakistan singing Vaishnav Jan to tani kaye peer parai jane re. So to me, that is South Asia. That is South Asia, which I'm sure that's this kind of a gathering is going to give us some ideas. And Ankush went there in 2013, and he wrote these 5-6 lines, and that's the last thing I'll say. मेरे और तुम्हारे और मेरे घर के बीच एक दीवार खड़ी है. तुम्हारे और मेरे घर के बीच एक दीवार खड़ी है, जो संग दिली के पत्थर और स्वार्थ की मिट्टी और आंसू और खून के पानी और रिश्तों के मलबे से बनाई गई है. So this wall that is standing between your house and mine, it is made out of संग दिली के पत्थर, स्वार्थ की मिट्टी, आंसू और खून के पानी और रिश्ते के मलबे से ये दीवार बनाई गई. And then he says, लोग कहते हैं कि हमारे बीच में ये दीवार नहीं थी, सिर्फ एक खुला आंगन था जहां हमारी पीढ़ियां साथ वक्त गुजारा करती थी. किस्से किस्सा गोइयों पर हंसते थे, stories, we were laughing. किस्सा गोइयों पर कहे लगाते थे, जाड़े में नर्म धूप सेंकी जाती थी और एक दूसरे के आंसू पोंछे जाते थे. We used to wipe each other's tears. And the last line he says, फिर एक दीवार बन गई. एक दूसरे का चेहरा नहीं देख सकते. जाड़े की नर्म धूप दोनों का आंगन सेंकती है. Both आंगन्स are lit up by the winter sun. और एक की आंखों, and this is such a beautiful line, और एक की आंखों की नमी दूसरे की दीवार सील जाती है. If I cry, your wall gets water in it. और दीवार के उस तरफ जब कोई दुआ के लिए हाथ उठाता है तो दूसरी तरफ से आवाज आती है, आमीन. Very simple, very evocative, and anyone who says that Urdu is a language of Muslims and it's a Muslim language and this and all of that, what is going on, I mean, you see the languages, there is absolutely no barriers. It is equally the language of Anand Narayan Mulla. It is the language of Raghupati Sahai Firaq Gorakhpuri. It is the language of Jagannath Azad. It is the language of the most revered Kashmiri poet called Brij Narayan Chakbast. This is everybody's language. And that is why language and translation, they transcend borders and boundaries. So thank you very much. I will put a stop here and look forward to the rest of this.